Hi, my name is Dr. Joe Dispenza.
How could I begin to influence my future? It requires one amazing thing, and that is gaining knowledge, gaining information. Every time you learn something new, you make a new connection in your brain. That's what learning is. And as you begin to think about new ways of being and you're learning new information, the brain begins to fire in new sequences and new patterns and new combinations. And whenever you make the brain work differently, you are changing your mind. Mind is the brain in action. So when we begin to get creative, something unusual happens. We stop living by those survival emotions. Those survival emotions alter our perception and cause us to look at the future through the lens of the past. As we begin to design a new way of being, we have to lay down the very thing that we used our whole life to get what we want for something greater to take over. Now we're talking about genius. Now we're talking about innovation. Now once the idea comes, the next step is that you have to take action. You have to do something with it. So for example, a person may say, I lost my job, and they may see it as the worst thing that ever happened to them. But Steve Jobs was fired from Apple. He was on the board and they fired him. And then he created Pixar. And then when he created Pixar, they hired him back onto Apple and Macintosh, and he became the leading executive. So when we have situations in our life, most people are defined by those situations emotionally. They brands them, and they no longer want to move forward. So, let's say a person loses their job, and they're confronting difficult conditions. But a person who would say, well, let me look at the world. China is doing very well. I have a little experience in computers. Hey, I have experience in sales. Oh, I know a person who travels back and forth to China. And we start having to think outside the box, so maybe I can begin to leave the present reality that I have and begin to explore new realities. Now, it means that you have to be willing to step into the unknown. It means that you have to step outside the familiar self. So there's this kind of model that says, here's the old self, and here's the new self. And there's a gap between the two. And when we no longer think, act, and feel in the same way, all of a sudden we start to feel uncomfortable. We start to feel unfamiliar. It starts to become unknown to us. And most people, the moment they step outside of the old self, because they're no longer making the same choice, they don't feel like themselves any longer. So the first thing they do is they make the same choices to produce the same behaviors, that create the same experiences, that produce the same emotions, and they say, this feels comfortable. Well, it feels familiar. The person, the maverick, who's willing to step out into the unknown, that unknown is the perfect place to create from. Because only in the unknown can you create something new. And if you and I can become comfortable in that unknown place, then the best way to predict the future is to create it from that unknown place. Now, when people start crossing the river of change from the old self to the new self, because they're no longer thinking, acting, and feeling in the same way, there is literally a biological, a neurological, a genetic, a chemical death of the old self. And this dark night of the soul, this unfamiliar place, is the true value, the true step towards developing a new self. So then if we're leaving the old and we are creating the new, then the next most important question is, well, if I'm going to create a new self, what thoughts do I want to think? What behaviors can I plan? And as you begin to image and rehearse a new way of being, you're changing your brain and body neurologically and biologically. That's the neuroscientific model of mental rehearsal. And as we begin to remind ourselves who we no longer want to be, and we remind ourselves every day of who we do want to be, there'll come a moment where we begin to silence the circuits in our brain that are connected to the old self and inhibit the chemicals that reaffirm the same identity, and then begin to fire and wire new circuits in our brain that begins to install the neurological hardware that begins to create a level of inspiration where we start seeing new possibilities. We see a new landscape, we see a new horizon. And that person who crosses the river of change then, all of a sudden has new opportunities in their life. And they're seeing possibilities that they never saw before. And the doors begin to open in their life. They begin to notice, wow, I'm so glad I got fired from that old job, because I would have never thought of living in China or traveling back and forth to Beijing and selling this product there. I never would have thought of opening a market in South Africa, whatever it is for the person. But they weren't thinking about it as their old self. They only can see it as their new self. So it's a time in history where crisis can be viewed as emergency, or crisis can be viewed as opportunity and innovation. And I think that people, when they begin to feel empowered by possibility, when they begin to see that the death of the old paradigms means the beginning of a new paradigm. Now here's the caveat. It's important because we know from the research that meditation lowers crime rate in communities. That's a fact. But when the meditators leave the community, the crime rate returns back to the same level. So it's not enough to just think peace or to think abundance. You have to demonstrate it. You have to demonstrate it in every single area of your life. In other words, if you don't like the war, you better not be warring with your coworker or arguing with your spouse. In order for you to stand up for peace, you have to be peaceful. If you don't like a government that's taking from you, start giving. Because as you begin to demonstrate that in your life, you give people permission to do the same. And as you and I begin to demonstrate peace in all areas of our life and everybody else does the same, something amazing happens. We move from this selfish model, driven by the hormones of stress, to this selfless model. And a selfless model means your heart is open and you are considering the whole when you make a decision, and that you and I are connected in some way. And I am trusting in the future instead of contracting from it, that I am connected to something greater, that I feel possibility in my life. And so we go from this selfish model driven by the hormones of stress that endorse the ego to the selfless model of everybody beginning to become connected. And so now if you're taking care of you, and you are taking care of, you're eliminating your anger or your frustration, because those hormones are very addictive, and I'm taking care of my fear and my anxiety, and someone else is taking care of their judgment and their criticism, and they're overcoming themselves. By each individual transforming themselves, the culture begins to transform very naturally. But if you're going to hold on to anger, if you're going to hold on to fear, if you're going to hold on to pain and sadness, then you'll never see possibility, and you'll only be interested in the immediate gratification that takes away that pain. Culture will never survive that way. So I think it's a very, very exciting time to be alive right now. I think a new model has to be put into place, and the model is based on selflessness. The model is based on the concept that if we want to see peace in the world, we have to demonstrate it. If we want to see abundance in the world, we have to be abundant. Gold only attracts gold. Lead doesn't attract gold. And if everybody was doing that individually and taking care of themselves, and they got that message in their head, you would see a culture all of a sudden begin to unify and to begin to connect. And that kind of idealism begins to create this concept called oneness.